Now that we've been through the process of going out of Maya, creating a texture map, and bringing it back into Maya, let's talk a little bit about what the UVs themselves are doing. I'm going to open my UV editor, and I will also open my render view. We might close that if it gets cumbersome. While I'm waiting for the render view to open, I will go ahead and select that sitting ducky. And now it shows up here in the UV editor, and I can see it here as well. Now, the first thing that you're going to need to know about how UVs work is that they are considered objects and they're movable. So if I take one of these UV shells and I move it, first you can see that my render will continuously update. But now as I move it, what that does is it causes it to read from a different collection of pixels. So as this render updates, part of this foot is going to turn white. You'll remember that earlier I said that there are facilities that will let you overlap UVs. You'd want to do that if, for example, you wanted these 2 feet to be completely identical. Having overlapping UV shells would make sense because then I can apply a single texture map to both shells. Awesome! Makes my life easy. Truthfully, there are very few instances where you want 2 sides to be completely symmetric. Symmetry is one of those things that happens very, very rarely in nature. Most objects are at least a tiny bit asymmetric. That's just the way life works. But if you want your shaders to be symmetric, overlapping UVs make your life a lot easier. You also noticed when I was lining this map up that one of the things I did was to very carefully make sure that there was a little bit of room around each shell. That was so that I could overlap. Most programs that help you paint UV maps will give you something like a 3 or a 4 pixel feather or bleed area around each of your UV shells. Photoshop doesn't, it's very precise with what it does, but most programs do, so having some area around each of the shells is going to be a boon to you. Next, the size of each of your UV shells is relative, so if this beak was really unimportant, I could take it and I could scale it down an awful lot, and that would give me fewer pixels that I could use to paint the beak, but more space that I could use to make my other shells bigger. So one thing that you'll see sometimes when you look at professional UV maps is that artists have done something like make a character's face really big so that they've got a lot of space to paint on the face, but then maybe the feet are smaller because you just need to throw a shoe texture on there. So you can scale your UVs depending on whether you want more or fewer pixels to paint them. Last, I'll say that these UV shells are not only used for texturing. There are plenty of other things in the program that look for the flattened version of your model. When we get to rigging, we'll talk about weight painting. Weight painting will always read from your UV map. One other thing that you may not have noticed because I was a little bit clever about it is that the area between the shells is always going to have a very hard line around it. So if I look at the beak and the body of the little ducky, I will see that there's a hard line here, and that's because one shell ends and the next shell begins. If I had the camera placed any other place, you would see that where the feet and the legs connect, because there's a gap between the UV shells. If I had tried to paint the legs a different color from the body, that would also most likely have caused me to have a seam in my texture. You can see that a little bit on this foot where this yellow color wraps around in a kind of an awkward way. These texture seams are caused by the placement of my border edges. And as a UV artist, one of the things that I always want to do is try to put my border edges in places where texture seams won't be noticed. Because this duck is sitting down, I knew that the connection between the foot and the leg wouldn't be seen, so I thought that that would give me a really good place for a border edge. Similarly, I can't see the back of this duck. This edge here corresponds to the back of the duck. It's completely invisible to the render, so I won't see a texture seam there. The other thing texture seams do is they help to alleviate distortion. I'm going to turn on a checkerboard pattern, and for this I will pause this render. The checkerboard won't show up in the render anyway. This button here will turn on a checkerboard overlay so that I can look at the distortion patterns of my UV shells. In the 0 to 1 space, this checkerboard pattern, every square is completely square. As I look at my UV map on the ducky, I can see that some of the squares are kind of starting to stretch out a little bit. This one's a little bit bigger than the ones next to it. Those are places where my UV maps, and thus my pixels, will become distorted. If I put more border edges in this area, I could alleviate some of that distortion, but I would create a visible seam in the texture, and maybe when I was making this map, I thought that this edge was not a good place for additional distortion. And if I turn that back off, now you'll be able to see as I zoom around here that places like this foot to leg connection would indeed have a texture seam. So as we go into the next part of the project, where we make the UVs for this ducky here, just keep in the back of your mind that these edges, these border edges, serve a really important function. They alleviate distortion, but they also cause texture seams, and that's not great. So hopefully this gives you a little bit of an understanding about UVs before we move into the next step. As always, if you need to go through this process a few times before you understand what we're doing with the image files, that's totally fine. Go right ahead, rewatch these videos. Whenever you feel more confident, then come join me on the standing ducky and we are going to make a new UV map.